Hello, and welcome back to Hope is Kindled, a podcast where we search for meaning in literature and history, even when the stories are heavy, even when the night is long. In today's episode, we walk into the final, chaotic hours of the Vietnam War through the lens of Bob Drury and Tom Clavin's remarkable book Last Men Out, the true story of America's final hours in Vietnam. This is a story not just of endings, but of sacrifice, courage, and the long shadow that war casts on the human soul. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 marked not only the end of American military involvement in Vietnam, but the end of an era marked by misguided policies, brave service, and the lives of countless civilians left behind. In Last Men Out, we follow the 16 U.S. Marines of the Embassy Guard Detachment who remained behind to secure the final evacuation. The narrative pulses with tension, patriotism, and heartbreak as these men executed their mission with unwavering discipline and humanity, knowing that chaos surged around them and their time was nearly up. This episode will be difficult, but essential. Because history is not a series of clean conclusions. It is messy. It bleeds. And in books like this one, we are reminded of what it means to endure, to protect others even at great cost, and to leave with dignity when victory is no longer possible. We'll bring in historical, biographical, and psychological analysis, connecting this text to our previous episodes on the Killing Zone, Night, the death and life of Dith Pran, the Killing Fields, and Catch-22. We'll draw comparisons to figures like Bob Dylan, Gandhi, and Homer because their words have long tried to articulate the same paradoxes. How to live with honor in a world gone mad. How to protect hope when everything around you is falling. And we will look for light, because it is there, even in the final moments, even in the silence that comes after the helicopters vanish. As we stated previously, the fall of Saigon was more than a mere military event. It was the culmination of decades of miscalculation, idealism, colonial legacy, Cold War paranoia, and, most tragically, the abandonment of millions whose lives were caught between ideologies they did not choose. Last Men Out focuses on the final hours, but behind those hours is a world unraveling. As the North Vietnamese army approached the capital, thousands of South Vietnamese civilians flooded the U.S. Embassy, desperate for escape. The embassy gates, like the gates of judgment, held back the tide of history, and in those moments, the final U.S. Marines were tasked with an impossible duty: hold the line while the country they were ordered to protect fell around them. The American evacuation of Saigon in April 1975 was the largest helicopter rescue operation in history, and Last Men Out gives it the harrowing dignity it deserves. The authors, Bob Drury and Tom Clavin, don't just recount events, they restore human shape to those swallowed by history. Through their meticulous interviews and research, we come to know the faces, the fear, and the flickering moral clarity that the last U.S. Marines held on to as Saigon crumbled. Captain Jerry Berry, pilot of the final chopper to leave the embassy roof, said,
"I felt like I was leaving my soul behind. Those people down there had helped us, and we left them."
It's a line that echoes throughout the region's historical aftermath, a whisper heard again in the rice fields of Cambodia, in the refugee camps of Thailand, in the songs of Miss Saigon. What stands out in Last Men Out is not the scale of the operation, though massive, but the personal, painful resolve of those who stayed behind. Consider Master Gunnery SGT, Juan Valdez, who refused to leave until every other American had been accounted for, running through the chaos, checking names, checking hearts. Or Corporal James Coolican, who said of the final hours,
"I remember the heat of the night, the sweat, the constant buzz of blades. But mostly, I remember the faces of the Vietnamese waiting outside the gates, mothers holding babies, old men clutching photographs. No one was screaming. They were just waiting."
That quiet image, people not screaming, but waiting, is a detail that strikes like poetry. It captures the exhaustion of a people used to being betrayed, used to being last in line, hoping this time might be different. And as the Marines lifted off from the rooftop, those who remained below rushed the embassy walls, trying desperately to climb in. Last Men Out quotes one Marine saying,
"They were trying to climb into the chopper skids, to hang on, like the world was ending, and we were the last ladder up."
And perhaps, for many of them, it was. Nowhere is this sense of finality, dread, an impossible love more poignantly captured than in Miss Saigon's haunting ballad Last Night of the World, as Chris and Kim cling to each other amid the roaring collapse.
In a place that won't let us feel, in a life where nothing seems real, I have found you, this is the hour, now is the time, I will love you until I die.
The lyrics rise above sentiment and become prophecy. This is the last night of their world. Outside their window, the streets fill with chaos. People bribe guards, scale fences, shout into dead radios. Helicopters roar overhead, while the past collapses underfoot. The embassy gates were no longer borders, they were tombstones, inscriptions of who got out and who didn't. This mirrors the killing fields, where Dith Pran is left behind by journalist Sidney Shanberg, despite their deep friendship. In the death and life of Dith Pran, we see how the American withdrawal, while logistically complete, left a spiritual wound wide open. Those who had placed their trust in Western promises were left to face genocidal regimes alone. Dith Pran called it the second death, the betrayal of memory. The pattern repeats in Miss Saigon, where Kim's sacrifice, giving up her child so he may live free, mirrors a nation's desperate hope for the next generation. In her final act, she sings,
You will be who you want to be. You can choose whatever heaven grants. As long as you can have your chance, I swear I'll give my life for you.
Her words could be spoken by any of the Vietnamese allies, lovers, translators, and friends who helped American forces. They could be spoken by the Marines themselves. What Last Man Out teaches us, especially when paired with the larger context of the war's aftermath, is that wars don't end when the troops go home. They echo. They ripple across time, across borders, across generations. The psychological weight of these final hours, the guilt, the resolve, the duty, lives in every moment of the book. These men were not politicians. They weren't generals shaping policy. They were young, scared, proud, and loyal. And they chose to stay until the last man was accounted for. The destabilization did not stop with Saigon's fall. It spread. It rippled into Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge rose to power within weeks. Their genocidal reign claimed over 1 million lives. In our earlier episode on the killing fields, and in the death and life of Dith Pran, we bore witness to what happens when world powers leave, and madness takes root. The haunting phrase Year Zero was not just rhetoric, it was reality. An erasure of history, of memory, of humanity. And here is where the connection to Miss Saigon becomes especially poignant. That musical, inspired by Madame Butterfly, dramatizes the chaos and heartbreak of evacuation, the loss, the betrayal, the impossible choices. Kim's tragic end, holding her child, giving him up for a better life, mirrors thousands of true stories. Stories of interpreters, allies, lovers, friends, left behind in the dust of retreating helicopters. The Marines in Last Man Out knew they were the final thread between order and catastrophe. And while some chose to evacuate earlier, these 16 stayed. To protect, to serve, to do what they could. Not because it would change the outcome, but because it was right. That moral conviction is why this story matters. If the collapse of Saigon shows us the end of one era, it also compels us to ask, what comes next? What do we do with the stories left behind? With the guilt, the loss, the ghosts of those we could not save? And what do we teach the next generation about those final hours? This is where the heartbeat of hope is kindled lives. Because no matter how grim the record, we return to these works not to wallow, but to learn. As Gandhi said in the story of my experiments with truth,
You may never know what results come of your actions, but if you do nothing, there will be no result.
that is the very essence of the men in Last Men Out. They didn't stay because it was safe. They stayed because it was right. Because their actions, even if forgotten by history, would leave behind a different kind of legacy, one of honor. In this way, the story becomes a quiet hymn to duty, to the kind of courage that doesn't demand medals or parades. When the helicopters lift and the last men leave, history has a way of pretending the story is finished. Last Men Out resists that lie. But to understand what truly comes after withdrawal, after survival, after loss, after moral fracture, it helps to look at the life of Frederick Downes Jr., author of The Killing Zone. Downes did not walk away from Vietnam whole. He left the war permanently disabled, carrying physical wounds that never healed and psychological weight that would shape the rest of his life. His survival was not triumphant. It was complicated, painful, and enduring. And yet, what makes Downs essential to this episode is not what happened to him during the war, but what he chose to do after. Downs spent years doing the slow, often invisible work that follows catastrophe. He became a teacher, a writer, a witness. He dedicated his life to telling the truth about Vietnam, not to justify it, not to redeem it, but to understand it honestly and to help others understand the cost. This is hope after disaster. Not hope as recovery, not hope as forgetting, but hope as responsibility carried forward. Downs did not try to erase the war from his identity. He integrated it. He allowed it to reshape what his life was for. In doing so, he modeled something Last Men Out quietly honors: the idea that surviving a moral collapse does not end one's obligation, it transforms it. The Marines at the embassy in Saigon could not change the outcome of the war. Downs could not undo the damage Vietnam caused. But both represent a crucial through line. When victory is impossible, integrity still matters. Downs' later life reminds us that what follows withdrawal is not closure, it is long-term moral labor. Writing, teaching, remembering, refusing easy narratives, accepting that some debts are not repayable, only acknowledged. In the universe of Hope is Kindled, Frederick Downs stands alongside figures like Elie Wiesel and Dith Pran. Not because they were untouched by catastrophe, but because they refused to let catastrophe be the end of meaning. Hope, here, is not loud. It is deliberate. It is sustained across decades. It looks like showing up long after the war is over. Like telling the truth when silence would be easier. Like choosing to build something humane from the ruins of something inhumane. That is what comes next. Not redemption. Not absolution. But instead the quiet insistence that survival carries responsibility, and that memory, when honored, can still serve the living. These men acted in the belief that even one more person saved, one more hour bought, mattered. This is the kind of moral conviction we saw in the Iliad, as Sarpedon reminds Glaucus.
Ah, my friend, if once escaped from this battle, we were ever to escape old age and death forever. I would not fight on the front lines, nor would I send you. But since no man escapes it, let us go forward.
Just like Achilles at Troy, like Pran in the killing fields, like Chief Bromden in Cuckoo's Nest. These men knew they were trapped in a world that was breaking apart, and still they chose action over despair. In the shadow of the burning embassy, there is also the shadow of Camus' myth of Sisyphus. The absurdity of lifting rock after rock, knowing it may roll down again, but choosing to push anyway. Because in the choice, there is freedom. This is what makes Last Men Out so important for young readers today. It teaches that even in times of confusion, betrayal, and despair, honor is not something given. It's something chosen. Quietly. In private. When no one may remember your name. Bob Dylan captured this with aching clarity in Chimes of Freedom. There were no trumpets in Saigon. But there were chimes of freedom, faint, maybe, but real. They rang in the hearts of the Marines who pulled people through the gates, of the pilots who flew back into the storm again and again, of the Vietnamese mothers who passed their children to strangers, believing, just maybe, they could have a chance. These acts of decency, of love, of sacrifice are why we must remember. Because as we saw in 1984, when stories are erased, when the past is rewritten or forgotten, so too is hope. The ministry of truth can win only if we stop telling the truth. That's why Last Men Out is essential. It keeps the truth alive. And it's why this podcast exists. Because even in the darkness, we must carry the flame. We are living in times again when many young people feel disillusioned, caught in a web of conflict, misinformation, and division. But this book, this story, tells them something powerful. You may not be able to change the world. You may not be able to save everyone. But you can choose not to abandon your post. You can choose to stay, to help, to witness. And sometimes, that's enough to light the way. In Frankenstein, the creature wept when he discovered Milton's Paradise Lost, not just because of the language, but because of the loss. Because he wanted to be better. And wasn't that the cry of the Marines in Saigon? Wasn't that the cry of Dith Pran, of the French girl in Miss Saigon, of so many children caught in the ruins? That ache, to try again, to be better, is the spark of hope. We've walked together through some heavy stories, the killing fields, night, heart of darkness, catch-22. But through them all, a common thread has remained. Even in ruin, people try to do good. Even in silence, someone listens. Even in the last minutes of the war, hope did not vanish. It boarded helicopters. It whispered prayers. It wrote letters home. And that's why we remember. That's why we tell stories. It is impossible to tell these stories responsibly without saying this plainly. We owe our veterans more than gratitude. We owe them care, dignity, and lifelong support. Every person who serves carries a burden that most civilians will never fully understand, and that burden does not end when the uniform comes off. The treatment of Vietnam veterans remains one of this country's deepest moral failures. Men and women sent to fight an ambiguous war, asked to carry impossible weight, and then met at home with silence, suspicion, or outright hostility. That betrayal compounded the damage of the war itself, and it must never be repeated. To honor our cherished armed forces means more than words or ceremonies. It means committing to mental health care, medical support, meaningful reintegration, and public respect that does not fade with time or politics. Taking care of veterans is not charity. It is a moral obligation, and it is one of the clearest ways a society proves it has learned from its own history. Thank you for staying with us through the difficult stories. Thank you for believing, as we do, that the world can be better if we choose to remember and choose to hope. Good journey.